Welcome to the meeting, everyone. My name is Maria Bonneville, and I'm the new chair of the Accessibility and Affordability Working Group. Mary Ann, can you please take roll?
Sure. Dan Burnell.
Present.
Maria Bonneville.
Present.
Ann Boynton.
Present.
James Benedetti.
Here.
Dana Dornshide.
Present.
Dana Goldman. Ed Goldstein.
Present.
David Higgins.
Here.
Harlan Levine.
Here.
Pat Levitt.
Here.
Adriana Padilla. Amar Kadan. Al Roulette.
Present.
David Serrano Soul. Maheswari Sempo.
Present.
Adrian Shapiro.
Present.
Jonathan Thomas.
Here.
Thank you, Mary Ann. I wanted to start off by saying that I'm really honored to chair this working group of the board, whose mission is so vital to the people of California. The ICOC and indeed all Californians are greatly benefited by the dedication of the members of this working group who volunteer their time to serve on this panel and provide their hard-earned expertise to help guide the Institute in achieving its mission to enhance accessibility and affordability of the treatments and cures arising from CIRM funding. We cannot say thank you enough for your time and effort, and we want to ensure that your valuable time is respected and your ability to meaningfully participate in the development of our programs is assured. To that end, I've been working with the internal team to bring to this working group a plan that covers the next 3 to 5 years of its work. It is important that we have a clear understanding of what the team is focused on, plans to achieve, and the steps required to get there. I'm looking forward to more in-depth conversations around pricing and the challenges we face in this area, and how to make clinical trials and therapies available to those who otherwise might not have that opportunity. I would love to hear from all of you on this working group on issues you believe are important to discuss and address during our time together. A clear path gives us the opportunity to measure our progress and success and reflect on things that didn't work out quite as we expected. It helps focus our efforts on what is critical to achieving agreed upon goals and avoid unnecessary distractions. In this way, we will ensure that the working group achieves its potential to provide invaluable assistance in ensuring access and affordability to the California patients. This is not to say we haven't been doing anything. We recognize that we've already made such great progress. The Patient Support Services Program, listening sessions for the community care centers that are underway, with a concept plan for that coming to you later this year, and the Alpha Clinics program with its new focus on community outreach and engagement. These initiatives are critical to our success, and I look forward to working with all of you and the Med Affairs team in developing a plan that includes these initiatives, among others, in a comprehensive and thoughtful longer-term plan. And with that, I'd like to turn this over to Sean.
All right, thank you, Maria. Our newly elected Vice Chairman. Mr. Chairman as well, thank you for the opportunity. Today, we're going to be giving an update on the Access and Affordability Working Group. And I'll let Mary Ann show the slides and we'll kick this off. All right, well, thank you again for your time today. The purpose of today's meeting is twofold. One, to provide an update on the most recent Inland Empire Community Care Centers of Excellence listening session. This took place at University of California, Riverside. Many of you attended. And then two, we're going to transition back over to the roadmap to give an update on a number of policy issues that we think are pertinent to our journey in the roadmap to access and affordability. So first, Jeff is going to give an update. I will, before I do that, I want to reorient everybody to the next slide. So I know everybody's terribly busy, but this is just to reorient everybody to our roadmap to access and affordability. This is sort of our working slide that has a number of strategies, and many of you have seen this before. Today, right out of the gate, we're going to talk about the AFTA clinics and the Community Care Centers of Excellence, specifically the CCCE. And then after that, again, I'll go into policy that's important to California, particularly in the cancer setting. So with that, let me go ahead and punt it over to Jeff to to give an update on the Community Care Centers of Excellence. Jeff?
Thank you, Sean. Can I get the next slide, please? So as a reminder, as part of the CIRM process for developing any new initiative, there's a phase in which I'm going to call it the needs assessment phase, where we really understand, where we have a sort of general sense of the scope of the program. In this case, it's to bring medical research platforms out into communities, particularly those communities where there's been less activity in terms of clinical trials, clinical research, et cetera. And the aims of the needs assessment is to, as it is in the title, is to get a better sense of the needs, of how the needs of those communities relate to what CIRM has to offer in terms of clinical research. And so we're trying to, in that vein, we're trying to understand the capacities within those regions to support clinical research, because that's what CIRM's mandate is to provide those opportunities. In addition, as with any CIRM initiative, we are looking at the workforce development and training needs in those areas, because it's really the people that are going to support the sustainability of these efforts. And in particular, particularly with this program, we really see it as an opportunity to engage in partnerships with community-based organizations, and a number of board members have been encouraging us to really use this as an opportunity to begin to forge those relationships in the conceptualization of this program. So we held the first one in Fresno and gave you a report back, and going to talk a little bit now about our Inland Empire listening session. Thank you. And again, just a shout out to Emily and Maribel, the two project managers that really make these sessions happen. There's a lot of organizing. We're going out into areas where we don't have as the mature contacts, and they make friends and make these sessions happen. So thanks so much for their effort to make this happen. We had a session, this first one, we're going to have another one. We're going to have a second session in the Inland Empire, but the first one was on the UC Riverside campus. I would say the group was a combination of academics from the UC Riverside campus, some community-based groups that focus on health needs assessment, and then a few patient and clinicians from the area. And some of the sort of overarching themes that really stuck in terms of this session was, first of all, the idea that you're going to do an experimental treatment on a population that has a primary care deficit. That presents a real challenge. And I think we know that, but we're now hearing that with some frequency in these sessions. So kind of elevates it as this is a recurring theme.
Hey, could you go deeper on that theme and explain, is it they're saying that we should be focusing more on primary care and worry less about experimental, or what's the point that's being made in that bullet?
So I think that's right. I mean, we're challenged. We're a research organization. We do research. I think when you start talking about health needs in these communities, the very first thing you're going to hear is, well, that sounds like a really interesting program, but we need the basic care.
Got it.
There is a basic care deficit.
So I've heard that for years, and I understand that, they're pregnant women without nutrition and we have a drug problem. So I just wanted to make sure I understood the point that was being made. So thank you. Yeah. And we try to both, we understand that point. And then we also try to be clear in terms of, what CIRM is and isn't able to do in that context. And I think that, again, that's part of the engagement process, is coming to that understanding. I think the other piece is, I thought it was really summed up nicely, and that as we engage, medical professionals can always come off as kind of agenda driven, that there really needs to be, it's a relationship building process and not a transactional process trying to get people into trials. So there's
there's whatever that infrastructure looks like, has to have the capacity to truly do engagement as opposed to, recruitment or just signing people up. I think one of the most animated parts of this discussion, and this has happened in both times now, is a real desire and interest in the room to, how do we create innovative communication opportunities within these programs? And particularly, how do we draw on young people, both because they have the creative energy, but also and for a number of these populations, particularly populations where they might have an immigrant population or English as a second language, often the younger generations are able to bring new information to the home, serve as translators. They're just have this sort of a connectivity that again was sort of viewed as valuable. And there were a number of examples actually of, particularly in the public health and health education setting, where these sorts of models worked, whether it was an arts project or again, something that engaged clubs, communities, and youth to then develop a message and disseminate it within the community. And then finally, I touched on the clubs and then also the community-based organizations that, again, we really need to sort of find ways to really cultivate those relationships and build them into this program. So I'll pause there. Are there any additional thoughts, questions? Otherwise, I'll get into a bit more detail. Okay, next slide. So, and this is, as a reminder, just sort of how we're sort of organizing the information we're collecting. I'm going to go through sort of 3 bins where we're collecting information. And the first is kind of clinical readiness, and that speaks towards sort of what sort of infrastructure capacities are in the regions that can support the CIRM effort. And as a reminder, in Fresno, we were a little bit more in a slightly more clinically focused area where we were in a cancer center, whereas Riverside was really interesting because it was a center for healthy communities. So their work tended to be a bit more on the community-based participatory research and more intervention with communities at the education and engagement level as opposed to a clinical cancer center. They had a very high capacity to do community-based, research. As even in the lead up to these discussions, we learned a lot about efforts they had made with a lot of populations in the region, both, certainly in public health, but also in clinical work, particularly, most recently in the vaccination area. So there's this kind of a rich history now of with the vaccine and COVID efforts, that there are sort of capacities there that we might want to, again, potentially leverage into the future efforts in the community care centers of excellence. Again, I've mentioned community-based participatory research, and then again, the role of community-based organizations. A lot of the work that UC Riverside Center had done in communities was mediated by community-based organizations in the vaccine program. So again, that connection was both conceptual and very specific in terms of COVID. One interesting sort of very specific point also was to the extent that we expect potential participants to their first point of contact to be their physician, some way to resource that, because as we're well aware, often your time, even your face time with physicians these days can be incredibly limited. So how do we allow that conversation to happen in a sort of sensitive way with appropriate time? And is there some way to resource the physician interaction with potential participants so that there's a quality interaction, there's a true engagement? It's not sort of just pointing someone to a trial and then they leave with no context or no understanding. Next slide, please. Training. again, I mentioned Fresno, where to sort of broaden Fresno, it tended to focus very much more on traditional clinical, grand rounds, networks, residency, the sort of a medical training, whereas it's interesting in Riverside, we got a broader perspective around career paths that would be more at the community engager level or the promotorist level. And again, the focus there was that there needs to be clear and compelling messages, which will be a challenge for the types of programs that we're trying to introduce people to. And there was, again, a very strong focus on literacy and understanding for younger audiences, whether it's in, down to sort of elementary school level. Again, the promotorists, and ultimately that workforce should be a reflection of the population, which again is consistent with the literature. Obviously, we're asking people to engage in an activity where there needs to be a high degree of trust. And in order to have that degree of trust, having sort of cultural and culturally sensitive messengers is obviously going to be very important in terms of that trust building exercise. So again, you can see it was very interesting to get this broader perspective. How we sort of then meld that into a funding program's going to be, I think, challenging but exciting. And I think is there one more slide? Sorry, I'm just losing track of where I am in the deck. Yeah, access and engagement. So, and this is the final bin, again, how do we better engage with the community? And in this case, the conversations were pretty similar, quite honestly. Again, this focus on, young professionals, and then it was the audience made a very strong plea that, that traditionally funders like us that fund programs, it's often challenging to get those resources down to the real community level, the clubs, the youth organizations, the groups that really can help in terms of developing this program. So, the basic message is we need funding, and then we need to make the engagement activities rewarding for the messengers. And I think that's actually really easy because we heard from we had some Bridges students in the room, and they really talked about how exciting it was for them to go out and, talk about these opportunities, and they want to do more of it. They find it rewarding. They were doing it on their own time, but obviously that's not sustainable. So to the extent that can be a sustainable activity through, say, something like the Bridges program, that was a message we heard. Again, I'm getting a little bit redundant here, but when you hear things repeated, that's important. That's information. Foster innovation in the communication, multimedia, those sorts of activities. And again, tailor the message and segment your audience. We know, obviously, with the highly diverse populations in California, there needs to be some segmenting of that message so that it's culturally appropriate. So I think that covers it.
Jeff, can you tell, can you mention to the group what the next meetings are, like where they are, and then the big one, and whether or not any of the working group members would like to join by Zoom and listen in?
Sure. So we are very close to finalizing a second meeting in the Inland Empire. And what the aim of that meeting is we're working directly with a nonprofit in the region. I spent a bit of time describing this audience. It tilted a little bit towards sort of academics and professionals in the community. This meeting will be very much focused on community-based organizations that work directly with the different populations in the community. So we're going to get away from the academic side and more towards that health intervention type of organization that's out in these communities working with diverse populations. That's scheduled for early March. I don't know if we have the exact date, but we'll get it to you. We're just in the process of settling it. And it will be is it Palm Desert?
It's Palm Desert.
Palm Desert, yeah. So we're going to be out in a desert community. And then the aim from there is to pull everything together that we've done from that will then be our third session. And we're going to schedule a statewide meeting. And I think right now we're targeting early May for Sacramento. It'll be on the UC Davis Medical Center campus in Sacramento. And that will be an opportunity for, really anyone and everyone who's sort of connected up with this program. So we'll have the Alpha clinics there. We'll have potential applicants. Obviously, board members and members of this working group will be lobbied to attend. And that's where we really want to try to walk through both, reporting back on the results. And then typically what we're able to do in sessions like that is then bring people back out again and really get them to sort of map out what a potential RFA would look like. What are the components now that based on everything we've heard, what are the components within that RFA that we need to create a funding space for to make this program a success? Is that covering the question?
Yes, thank you. JT?
So just for members of the working group, these sessions are 3+ hours each. Jeff does a great job of running the discussion and sort of managing the ebb and flow of the topics that are brought up and segueing into various things that we want to discuss. But the sort of the overwhelming takeaway I want to convey to folks on the working group is this obviously is all about the accessibility part of the AAWG's work, and these sessions have, what would you say, 30 to 50 attendees, something like that?
Closer to 30, yeah.
Yeah, and they're from all different stakeholder groups and perspectives, and each person brings a lot to the table, and they're very engaged. So the communications are robust, they're highly participatory. The level of enthusiasm for the concept of a community care center of excellence in areas such as Fresno, such as Riverside, is highly pronounced. This is they want access. They want to be the communities all want to be a part of this, and this is really an invaluable way of not only teeing up the community care concept, but of getting CIRM's message in general out to parts of the state that may not be as familiar as those with the academic centers that have alpha clinics, for example. So I think that these are highly valuable meetings, and I think will pay real dividends down the road as the community care centers of excellence concept is trotted out formally and people can apply. There is no question that these areas will be front and center in the applicant pool once this program is initiated. So just want all of you guys to know that this is really doing a major part in advancing the goals and mission of the AAWG. And I would echo what Marie and Jeff have said, which is at a future meeting of this sort, I think if you can take the time to attend either on Zoom or even better in person to get a real feel for the dynamics of these discussions, it would be well worth your time. So thank you.
Thank you. We'll move on, Mary, on the next slide. And I don't want to move to the policy section yet. I still want to keep this open because I'm not sure if other people have had the opportunity to opine on community care centers of excellence. This is a big important component of our strategic roadmap. There are lots of touch points with the community care centers of excellence. This is only our third presentation for the AAWG on the roadmap. So, but we do visualize a lot of different outgoing and inbound participation with the CCE on the research side, all the way to potential, infusion of commercialized therapies. But let me pause here just for a sec, just to see if anybody, the committee members have additional comments or questions. Okay, very good. So what we're going to do now is transition to another topic. And this is, of course, very important and actually leads into our roadmap. And this is addressing more of the state policy. Interesting enough, I'm going to talk about a policy that is now actually a law. Next slide, Mary, please. That CIRM has supported. And this is the California Cancer Equity Act, or more known as CCCEA. That's a mouthful. But for background, the California Cancer Equity Act took effect this year, enabling the most vulnerable cancer patients the option to seek optimal care more easily at an NCI designated center. And as you know, there are 10 designated centers in California. They provide a number of opportunities. One is to consult with one of the centers all the way from genomic testing to precision-based care, subspecialty expertise, and more importantly, clinical trials. Now, as I've learned, this law is intended for patients who have exhausted all FDA-approved treatments for their tumor type. So what they're up against is basically three options. One is a potential clinical trial at one of the NCI sites. The second is the hospice route. And the third potentially is compassionate use. There are a number of opportunities for us here at CIRM to help with this initiative. So this is just kicked off. I spoke to many subject matter experts who helped write part of this. And the first thing that we've identified is that there is absolute need from an educational standpoint out in the community in terms of educating what the California Cancer Care Equity Act is. Quite a few community oncologists that I spoke with were not familiar with it. They were waiting for something to be kicked off. Many of the nurses and staff were not familiar with it. So there's a great opportunity for us, CIRM, to have partner with other organizations that are out there for sort of an outbound educational initiative, either on the CME side for healthcare providers, but even more importantly for patients. The other thing that's important, and I'll come back to this comment in a few minutes. Second, not all the Medi-Cal providers under this program have NCI designated treatment centers. So that's one of the obstacles. So there's multiple Medi-Cal providers, right? And many of them don't have an NCI in their portfolio. So that's something else that we should think about considering how we can have an impact, maybe even at the state level at Medi-Cal. And the other thing, like any piece of legislation, there's a regression to the mean, right? So it's a good faith effort by the plans to go out there and educate, the community, the healthcare providers about this program. And so there's no real sort of meat, if you will, behind it to mandate that the plans go out there and be proactive. So there's a number of opportunities for us, CIRM, and for the AAWG to consider moving forward with potential educational programs, but even some more robust opportunities if, in fact, there's an additional legislation, maybe 2 to 3 years down the road, that might open up to more aggressive, if you will, opportunities for patients to get access to these sites. So finally, there's also a potential pharmacoeconomic option here that actually just came up last night. And there is a hypothesis that the pharmacoeconomics would be in the state's favor if in fact these sites opened up more for patients who are at the terminal stage. That is, generally they're offered the traditional commercial therapies, which are terribly expensive. And at the same time, they're not given the option for a potential novel clinical trial. And so there's an option for us to wrap in our HEOR here. This is sort of downstream, but really start to think through how CIRM can play a role in this initiative. And let me pause there and see if anybody has any questions or how that resonates with the AAWG with respect to this particular policy.
Dana has a question. Dana?
I really just have it's more of a nuance of verbiage. When we say most vulnerable, many people associate that with socioeconomic standing. But I believe, because Lazarox also supported this act, I believe when they say most vulnerable, they're referring to the complexity of a cancer diagnosis. So I just wanted to make that nuance.
Yeah, I can speak to that. And Dana, you're correct. But it's actually more, there's an additional layer of nuance. So most vulnerable meant that it was applied to Medi-Cal patients who have the most social determinants of health issues. So that this doesn't apply to the exchange, doesn't apply to private insurance or Medicare. And then within the Medi-Cal population, it is the most complex cancers. And then among the most complex cancers, it's those that have exhausted, traditional approved therapies. So it is a first step, but it is very targeted, as you suggested. And I think subsequent steps are going to be needed, but this was a heroic act to get, people to say people should be able to go outside their narrow networks or their HMO networks if there's life-saving opportunities at these NCI or other. There are other criteria that academic medical centers could qualify to be on that list.
And we certainly agree, which is why we absolutely endorsed it. So thank you for that, Harlan.
Yeah, we appreciated the support.
Sean, I have a question. I also just want to make sure this is something that would be in addition to the patient support services that we are planning on rolling out. This would be an add-on as more added support for patients that are enrolled in our trial. So I just want to make sure that we reorient ourselves, because this is obviously a very broad initiative that covers a lot. But in the context of us, this is something that is a supplement or added on to, and hopefully something that we can get education out about when somebody calls our patient support services and says, I want to enroll in this trial. Is there something, that you know of? We hook them up with something that's going on that CIRM's funding, and then this is something that they can also refer back to.
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of leads into the next slide about potential opportunities we want to stress test with the team here, of course. One, of course, is the grants with respect to a funding mechanism, right? That partner with somebody, as I mentioned earlier. Another opportunity is work directly with the state and Medi-Cal in terms of making sure that, or at least providing some service or assistance on that educational platform. The alpha clinics can also play a role potentially in the coverage analysis and patient treatment, or at least sort of navigation, but that leads directly into what Maria mentioned, and that is how patient support services could provide the heavy lift here, right? And this is in their sweet spot for the most part. Educating, navigating patients not to clinical trials, but more importantly, just providing fair, balanced information about something. So it could be a real sort of bolt-on, really easy turnkey with the patient support services. Absolutely.
Anyone have any questions?
Good. So no questions or comments. Any initiatives or any things that perhaps we're missing that we should consider with respect to this act, now a law?
Hi there. This is Ted Goldstein.
So one of the things that this act, as I understood when it was being prepared, I don't know how it finally ended up, is to provide access to precision medicine, genomic testing, and targeted therapy for Medi-Cal and patients, which it was always ambiguous about how that would be provided and to the degree to which it would get reimbursed and improved and so on. And I believe that what this initiative was to provide equity with private plans. Is that correct? Is that where it ended up as part of the what the legislation is about?
Yeah, that's correct. Harlan, did you want to opine on any of this?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question that Ted's asking, because I think some of that clarity is going to have to come over time. So I think what it allows is that for patients with complex disease, unfortunately near the end of their journey, they can then seek care, and all of those services, including precision medicine testing and all that, will be included in the package in the care plan that would be allowed at these academic centers, NCI, or a few of the other designated centers. It is not opening the aperture for cancer patients with Medi-Cal earlier in their stage who don't meet that most vulnerable status that we were discussing earlier. It does not open the door for them to get genomic testing or targeted therapy beyond what they get today. So it did not fully address what you had hoped it would, or what I infer you had hoped it would from the beginning. Right. And it got peeled back. And I think we should look at this as a first step, because it really is just tip of the iceberg type support.
Yeah, the big issue, and everyone who's been on tumor boards knows that by the time you get the data about what might be a useful targeted therapy and precision medicine, the patient has already progressed past the point where the therapies are useful. So it strikes me that the very purpose that wealthy people can still go out and get genomically tested at the first sign of cancer is and to find out what is the best targeted therapy for themselves is still still an inequity that exists. So I'm not quite sure the great benefit that we would hope is present yet.
I have a question, and I will acknowledge my own naivete as I ask the question, but it speaks to what Ted and Harlan just said about targeted therapy. And as an example, I have the privilege of being in charge of a community-based organization that serves these patients. And we discover, as Harlan described it, unfortunately, at a point when they're at the end of their options, albeit that they have a disease like cancer, not through primary care, as the fourth bullet might suggest, and now I'm going to hone in on my question, but through the emergency room doctor, who is unfortunately the place where a lot of these patients go to get their primary care, because of all the encumbrances and challenges associated with Medi-Cal. That said, I just want to make sure that when we think about primary care doctors, for a lot of again, I'm repeating myself, a lot of the patients that I advocate for, these kinds of experiences happen in the emergency room, where they are unfortunately told, hey, what you're experiencing is something, quite frankly, that may end your life because it's been untreated for years, and it's a condition that we, quite frankly, don't have an option for you today. And that happens all too often for behavioral health patients.
So, Al, I don't think this group can address and fix the problem, but I really want to pick up on what you just said, because it's really fundamental. So, and by the way, just as a an aside, frequently those patients that show up in the ER probably have some sort of referral to an oncologist in the system getting worked through, but never getting executed on.
Never.
But the bigger point I would add to your comment is that there's just so I'm a managed care guy, by the way. I most of my career before coming to City of Hope has been on the managed care side. So I think I know the business pretty well. There's just this fundamental belief that things have to be absolutely proven by case-controlled studies, and that research is sort of like an add-on and a privilege. And there's a lack of recognition that for cancer, things are changing so fast that research actually may be your best option. And by cutting out or making it harder for these underserved populations to get to research, you're actually, it's an inequity beyond just the fact that we're not learning enough about African American or Hispanic populations. Let me give you an example, and then I promise to be quiet at least for a few minutes. But if you had non-small cell lung cancer 10 years ago, if you didn't get to a research center, you were going to die in 6 months. But there was like a several year lead in these targeted therapies that were in trials that were pretty well proven, but just not FDA approved, that if you got on them, you'd be alive today. And even after FDA approval, there were several more years before doctors kind of felt comfortable using them or health plans allowed them. So there was this death gap of 5 to 6 years because people couldn't get on trials. And those people that couldn't get on trials were all disproportionately from underserved and minority populations. So we have to like reorient our entire thinking around research and what CIRM brings to the table. It's not a nice to have. For many people with these difficult conditions where pathway or guideline medicine gives you a 15% survival rate at 5 years, this is the best way to go for these patients. It's not a elective.
And I appreciate, Harlan, you building a bridge between my lack of understanding of this Cancer Care Equity Act. And I'll be the first to acknowledge this is my first time being introduced to this, and the patients that that I advocate for. Thank you.
So, I mean, this is all extremely important and very relevant. And one of the things which I'm very focused on my own work is in prostate cancer, the intrinsic inequities that race brings. But this is not the most top of mind thing about stem cell work and the work of the Institute. And I just want to make sure that, you know, we use the mission that the state of California has chartered CIRM with and our committee, which is to bring our focus on the things that stem cell research and the projects that we're supporting can, and make sure that, you know, the dots are connected, right, between the inequities that we see and the targets of the therapies that we are the stewards of. To me, that's that. You know, we're doing many things in many areas as part of the state, and that's really important. And I'm really glad and happy that, you know, at least progress, that there is some attention to this, even if it's not everything we want it to be. So I want to bring back to, you know, what do we see as the therapeutic connections, the actual medical applications that we think we can address that overlap with the domain of this legislation.
So maybe I can opine and then punt it to you, Maria, or do you want to go first?
Whichever, Chair.
Go ahead,
Chair,
Barbara.
why don't you? Yes. Thank you.
Ted, I think that's a really important question. And at the last meeting, Dr. Alba Creasy gave just a kind of an overview of our portfolio, but I wanted to just remind this body that we do have CAR T programs and next generation CAR T programs in solid cancer. We had a CAR T program actually for prostate cancer, as a matter of fact. So we do fund, some of these rare subsets of cancers that would fit into that category of third line, no other option, that would impact the subset that this particular act is addressing in the first instance. So I just wanted to point out there is a relevance and an opportunity. And again, to link it to what Maria said earlier, which is that is funded by CIRM. So by addressing that, it addresses specific programs, but it creates kind of the use case and the demonstration cases for how this act could be supported to bring access to California patients for cutting edge trials that Harlan had so eloquently put could be the best treatment options, even though they hadn't worked their way all the way through approval and all of the things to adoption. So anyway, I'm sorry, Sean, to cut in front. You may have been saying the same thing, but I just think it's such an important topic that I know, Sean, you've been, kind of talking to the team about.
Yeah, certainly. And Dr. Milan's spot on. So, from a policy standpoint, as we start looking at 4 or 5 year projections in terms of what our impact factor could be, and this is one that's sort of low hanging fruit where we could really measure the impact if we go out there and help get the education out there to the community docs. And as Harlan mentioned, many of the patients are 6th, 7th, 8th line, let's say, multiple myeloma, and would be looking to an experimental medication at one of those sort of, NCI sites, which, lo and behold, there are a number of CAR T infused therapies that we are supporting in our portfolio, and some of those patients may be able to qualify for that. So there's a number of touch points from an access standpoint. And more importantly, probably from an immediate access standpoint, something that we can measure, quite frankly, if in fact we did put something in play.
So not to belabor the point, but it sounds like this is just one more tool in our patient advocacy toolbox. Right? It's not going to really change anything we're doing in this, in the AAWG anyway, end of things.
Well, I would actually propose that we be a little bit more proactive and put something in play. So it does have touch points of what's going on with patient advocacy. I think this would be, if it was approved by this group and the AAWG, we could come back to you with a proposal on a very aggressive proposal on how we can get the word out, collaborating potentially with a number of other state organizations out to the community. The community care centers of excellence is not going to be up and running for some time. So I think this would be potentially a missed opportunity if we didn't get out there now and start putting some things in play from an educational standpoint. But I'm open to open for pushback from the team on that comment.
Dana, you have a question?
Just from our experience at Lazarex, we're 17 years in, and engaging at the community level with community physicians is, if they're not associated with a research institution, it's not easy as you might think. We thought initially, okay, well, we'll just go out there and introduce them to our clinical trial navigation and, travel reimbursement for patients to participate in trials. But if they're not familiar with the trials, they're not familiar with the technology, there's a hesitation for these doctors to engage in conversation with their patients around those topics because A, they have limited time, 11 minutes from the start to stop of an appointment. B, they don't necessarily possess the knowledge required to have a conversation and answer all of the questions. And C, they then become the conduit of information for that individual, which requires a serious, time sink from their perspective. So there are other issues, I think, that I would hope we would just keep in mind going forward around some of those challenges.
Thank you, Dan.
I think it's a really good point. And, we wrestled with that as we thought about the act. And so this is not a snapshot. This is going to be a movie because it's going to take time to change the mind share and the mindset of people. I guess where I would support Sean in doing this is that I think at the end of the day, if we don't inculcate into the system, the idea that looking for research opportunities is just part of the norm, it's never going to happen. And Dana's point is not going to happen in the individual doctor, like being the hero. But I do think we should take advantage of the fact that Medi-Cal here is managed, and there are groups, and there are medical directors, and there are leaders. And if we can figure out how to educate those groups, they should, and hold them accountable to educate their networks, their doctors, and their case managers, and the utilization management team, so that everyone is looking for the opportunity to help people. It takes time. I mean, it's not how we operate at all today, but I think we need to make this as a first step, and change the mindset of how we look at putting people into research trials. And by the way, underserved people, minorities aren't only in Medi-Cal, they're in exchange products and other HMO products. I mean, I think what I get excited by hearing Sean's proposal is this is sort of a first step of trying to raise the consciousness of these groups. And I don't think it can be at individual doctor levels. I think it has to be the group level and medical director level. But it's a heavy lift. It may be a pipe dream, but that's where I see the opportunity to try to lift up the state.
I'd like to interject really quickly. I think where this makes the most sense is approaching it from where our clinical trials are being administered. So the alpha clinics, and then through the trial sponsor directly. I think that's sort of what Ted was getting to is we have to focus in on what CIRM is, what our mission is, what we're funding, and where we can play, where we can make the most direct impact. What I don't want to do is take on a project or a plan that's over scope of what we do, because I look at that as a distraction, because this group has a lot that they need to accomplish in the course of the next 3 to 5 years. So unless it is directly related to something that CIRM is directly involved with, I don't know that it is the I think it would work best if that's sort of the approach that we take, is going through where our trials are administered, this trial sponsors, different, and educating around there.
Right. I mean, one of the things, for example, which I think, I'm sorry if you have a board in front of you.
Go ahead, Ted. And then Adrian's next, and then Dan.
Okay, thank you. So just by way of contrast, and cancer is what I've spent, the last decade of my life studying and working on. But I'm, directly relevant to the CIRM mission of stem cell, and the therapy that I think is unique is for sickle cell anemia. And there is an opportunity where if we should be looking for how do we make direct contact with the patients who are most vulnerable to it. It's not cancer, but it is something which, point of contact is often going to be the emergency rooms and the clinics where people go to get aid. And how do we make that connection as quickly as possible to clinical trials and therapeutic use? And I think that's a medical pathway that, if we can find equivalent ones in cancer, that the stem cell therapy is both unique and directly applicable to the CIRM mission, then we should address it in as wide a fashion as possible.
Adrian?
Thanks. Hi. So I was going to say,
in sickle, we have often looked at what they've done in cancer and for cancer to find what is possible and then try to get those things offered to us in the sickle world. So because it's so big and so many, right, for us, our health is done by hematologists. The idea of CIRM maybe doing some handouts or whatever for cancer in that sense is really great. But I want to say that two things. One is I would like for us to think a little bit outside the box as we look at things like patient support services. What we've found is we have created point of care advocates, and our point of care advocates go to either virtually or physically appointments with patients, also on the hospital floor, any place where they're having contact. And our advocates are trained not only to speak about sickle cell, but also to speak about things like clinical trials. And so I'd like for us to kind of look at maybe roles outside of the traditional roles of I'm going to say a provider role, or also of I don't want to say advocate, but just the traditional way. In order for us to do this and get the type of support patients are going to need, we're going to have to look for things outside of a doctor, outside of a nurse, outside of a psychologist. We're going to have to create some new roles in order to support patients through this. And one of the things we found is that the doctors, even if they're like 3 doctors in an area, once they get to know a health point of care healthcare advocate, and they've proven themselves, for lack of a better term, that they're much more likely to hear us and engage in conversations about possibilities of new treatments and curatives. And then the other thing is we've been trying really hard to get information into ERs, because there is a majority of the sickle community who goes to ERs for their health care. And one of the roadblocks we have there is the fact that the ER docs don't have materials that have been approved by the hospital, right, to actually hand out to the patients. So maybe us looking at things like that, maybe having CIRM behind how to get information out to patients no matter where they are at their point of care, could come under our scope. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrienne. Dan?
Yes, thanks. Thanks for the great presentation. Just, touching on maybe some of what Adrienne talked about and also what Al talked about, looking at the California Cancer Care Equity Act, I doubt opportunities in that came about by accident. I'm sure it involves some advocacy from former Vice Chair Senator Torres and others. I'm wondering if there are other opportunities on the horizon through moving legislation at the state or even the federal level where we could continue to look at carving out consideration like we're seeing here that requires, frontline clinical staff to really be well-versed in and able to direct people to trials and other things.
Well, I certainly know there's a lot of talk about updating the legislation. That's not my area of expertise, but certainly it's something we can keep on our radar. And if there's an opportunity, maybe this might be a first for CIRM, I'm just throwing this out here, to participate in that, right? So there's a lot of heavyweights here that have lots of touch points, and certainly that may be the second edition. I don't know if Harlan has any input on that or if that's been discussed externally.
I feel like I have a lot to add to that, and I think it's a great idea. Senator Portantino was the champion behind this. A year before, Senator Rubio was supportive of cancer patient Bill of Rights. it took a coalition to do this. But I think, if this group wanted to add its weight to the coalition and expand beyond cancer and address the issues, sickle and other targets for regenerative medicine, I think it would go a long way. I don't know what ability this group has to become political like that, but it was a highly political process. But I think Dan's entirely right. I without taking up too much more time here, I can tell you City of Hope is looking at expanding in California. And while it's hard, we're initiating some contacts in Washington right now to get us to either to the Congress or to the White House to discuss this really important issue. I think we all need to band together and work on this. And my point I was trying to make earlier was, cancer can't be isolated. I mean, the whole idea of putting someone on a trial, whether it's in an alpha clinic or a research center, it has to be part of a mindset, because it's part of patient flow. Because there'll be some patients where research at a UCLA is more, City of Hope is more appropriate than just the alpha clinic. I mean, there'll need to be some clinical decision making, and I think we just need to make it part of the system. And right now, with managed Medi-Cal and managed exchanges, it's just not part of the system. And that's what we need to do, is leverage legislation to change the consciousness of the healthcare delivery system. So I'm with Dan. I mean, I also nominate Dan to lead the charge.
Good context.
Second, let's call it, Chair, let's call the vote, please.
No good deed goes unpunished, Dan, so thank you.
Don't forget, we have our current vice chair with extensive legislative and experience as well, but happy to partner on that.
All right, everybody. Well, I want to thank everybody for their input. I think want to obviously, and thank you to Jeff for bringing everybody up to speed on the community care centers of excellence. That work stream is kicking off really quickly, so we are tracking for a concept plan this year. I do want to thank you for listening in on the opportunities from the Cancer Care Equity Act. I'm sure I'll receive emails from you for follow-up, and I encourage you to do that. And maybe we'll regroup internally and consider this for discussion, and also prepare for the next AAWG, which we have a lot of useful information all the way from real-world data collection to post-marketing surveillance. So lots of ideas coming your way.
Thank you, Sean. Thanks, Jess. Really quickly, does anyone have any other comments? And then we have public comment. I know there's something to read into the record. So are there any other comments from the group? Okay, Marianne, do you want to?
Yep, I will read it. This public comment is from Don C. Reed. CIRM in the fight to make cures affordable. 60% of American adults now live with at least one chronic condition. 42% have more than one. Nearly 30 million have 5 or more. These account for more than 40% of U.S. health spending. Certain conditions cluster together. For example, depression is associated with stroke and Alzheimer's disease, while TB and HIV/AIDS are associated with diabetes and cardiovascular disease. Clusters may be amenable to improvements in health and cost outcomes through shifts in healthcare delivery. This may be important. But is our country equipped to deal with a huge number of patients, each with multiple diseases? In a word, no. Like waterless deserts, America has vast areas lacking adequate medical care. In 2021, 8.3% of people had no health insurance. The number of people without health insurance varies. At 3%, Massachusetts has the fewest uninsured, while Texas at 18.4% has the most lacking insurance. This is why the work of CIRM's Accessibility and Affordability Committee is so important. CIRM must have a double goal. We need to not only come up with a cure for cancer and various other chronic diseases, but also make it cheap and affordable. Because if scientists come up with a cure for cancer, but it costs 20 million for each patient, it almost would not matter because who could afford it? Most of us expect that the price of therapies will be high at first, but then go down. Just as computers were unaffordable at first, but today are cheap as children's toys. Similarly, I believe our ultimate result will be to bring remedial therapies within the reach of everyone. It will take time and effort, of course, but that is why you are here. So thank you for every hour you spend, every day you work toward that incredible goal. The families of children yet unborn will have reason to bless CIRM's name.
Thank you to Don Reed for that. If there's nothing else, I think we stand adjourned and we will see you next month.